What fascinated me particularly when I came across your book, thanks to Brian, was that actually at the very beginning of my trajectory, I studied economy and ecology in Switzerland with Professor H.C. Binswanger, who directed the University of St. Gallen Institute of Economics and Ecology, and I studied there in the late 80s. Binswanger was examining the historical relationship of economics and alchemy, which he made as interesting as it at first sounds outlandish. His goal was to investigate the similarities and differences between aesthetic and economic value, most famously in a book he later published called Money and Magic in 1994. At the core of modern economics, Binswanger believed, is the concept of unlimited eternal growth. He showed how this brash concept was inherited from the medieval discourse of alchemy, the search for a process that could turn lead into gold. In his book, Binswanger pointed out that the moderation of growth has become a global necessity, or as he would always tell us as students, actually an urgency. He produces a way of thinking about the problems of rampant capitalist growth and encouraged us all to question the mainstream theory of economics and to recognize how it differs from the real economy. The wisdom of his works is that he recognized early on, actually, that endless growth is unsustainable. And of course, that idea that endless growth is unsustainable is at the very beginning of your work. And I wanted to actually begin with the very beginning and ask you how it all started, because I once read that already in your early teens, you started to do action for social justice.
Oh, wow. What a great introduction. Thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be here. The fact that you studied economics and ecology, even that you studied these two words together, is already a signal that you studied something very different, because most people don't study those two together. But that you studied it with Hans Binswanger, well, you really were off to a good start, because he, of course, is one of the great critics and early thinkers of rewriting economics and a more ecological economics. So you had a very unusual economic education as a result. Perhaps that's why I'm here. It's the long tail feedback loop of his teaching. So yeah, for me, I was, so I'm just about to turn 50 years old. And that means I was a teenager in the 1980s and watching the TV news. There was a famine in Ethiopia and there was a hole in the ozone layer. And I was growing up in Thatcher's Britain, of huge inequalities and unrest. And I wanted to know what would I need to study at university to be able to engage with these issues. And I thought it would be economics. And that's why I went off and studied economics. But I very quickly found that the tools I studied didn't give me the tools that I wanted to tackle, because unlike your course with Hans Binswanger, we weren't taught about unlimited economic growth and money and magic, and we weren't taught about questioning those challenges. We were just taught that the economy is, its success shows up as growth, and it was never questioned whether this could be limited or not. That just wasn't in the room. So it took me decades to throw off the assumptions that I was given at that point in life, and have the courage to start questioning them and find thinkers like Binswanger and others who had always questioned, but they aren't the mainstream text. They aren't the mainstream education you get. So I think for many students like myself, it's a really long route to come to question these ideas, because it means going against the whole education that you learned that didn't question these things at all.
And you, of course, then threw famously away the economics book temporarily. And actually, before then, you wrote your own book. You lived in Zanzibar. You went into activism. You also worked for Oxfam. Can you tell us a little bit about these experiences, actually, which led you to the Doughnut epiphany?
Yeah, so those old economics textbooks, I mean, I've got copies of them there. They're down on the bottom shelf at the end of my office. That I allowed them back in the room in the end. But yeah, no, I literally had to get rid of those books and ditch that thinking. Not to say that every single thing in it is wrong, but if you start from inside that system, you will only ever incrementally tweak it. And as you said, I worked in Zanzibar for 3 years. So I worked with barefoot micro-entrepreneurs in the villages of Zanzibar for 3 years. I then worked at the UN, UNDP in New York on the Human Development Report, which is where I actually met Hans Binswanger. And then I went to Oxfam and we campaigned on climate issues and labor rights in global supply chains for a decade. And then I became a mother. I had twins in 2008. And so that immersed me personally out of the world of work and into the work of the household economy. And I really understood gender and the division of labor and the intense work of unpaid caring, reproductive work that you don't understand until you're immersed in that economy, whether as a parent or a carer. And that, of course, 2008 was the year of the financial crisis. And the world starts running around saying, oh, we have to rewrite economics to make it make sense for what's just happened in finance, right? We need to bring a more realistic financial model into the heart of economics, because basically banks and the impact of banking and finance was missing from mainstream macro models. Phenomenally, but true. And I just thought, if we're going to rewrite economics at this moment in time, because there's been a financial crisis, but we're going to ignore the fact that we are living in a deep climate crisis and there is a global crisis of inequalities. I mean, there's no way we can just rewrite economics to add in a little fix on finance and leave everything else untouched. And when I came back from maternity leave, back to my job at Oxfam, somebody showed me a sort of deck of slides of big ideas that had happened in the previous year. And one of them was this picture. It was a green circle symbolizing the safe space on Earth, and these big red lines shooting out. It was by Earth system scientists saying we have overshot our pressure on life supporting systems, and they were called the planetary boundaries. And I was so impacted by seeing this picture. And it's great talking with you, thinking about galleries and displaying images, because I think images are incredibly important, not just artistically, but in terms of deep framing of the way we think. And of course, that's what artists are doing. I saw this picture of red lines shooting out of the earth, and it had a huge impact on me. I thought this is the beginning of the economics that I was never taught, because this economics, or this image, begins with what are the limits of pressure we can put on our planet. And look, we've overshot them. So it started with the planet. It didn't start with money. It didn't start with dollars or interest rates or growth rates. It started with carbon concentrations in the atmosphere and the depletion of soils and air pollution and the ozone layer. So I felt very excited that this was the beginning of a new economics, but it was just showing us how much pressure we mustn't go beyond. And I thought, I was sitting in this big open plan office in Oxfam, surrounded by people who were campaigning to prevent famine in the Sahel, campaigning for the rights of health and education for all in the world's poorest countries. And I thought, just as there's an outer limit to humanity's use of Earth's resources, there's also an inner limit of the distribution of those resources. So I drew a circle inside this circle, and suddenly it looked like a donut. I've got it here on a stick. Here, this is one I made earlier, as they say. So the outside of this is the 9 Earth system processes identified by these planetary boundary scientists. They said these are the life-supporting systems of planet Earth. We mustn't cause climate change or acidify the oceans, create chemical pollution, use too much fertilizer, withdraw too much water from the world's lakes and rivers, convert too much land, lose too much of ecosystems diversity, and create air pollution and a hole in the ozone layer. These are the 9 planetary boundaries. Don't overshoot this outer ring, but also don't leave anybody falling short in this hole in the middle on the essentials of life that Steffi so beautifully read out, many of those at the beginning: food, water, healthcare, education, housing, gender equality, political voice. So it becomes a balance between meeting the needs of all people within the means of the planet. And again, for me, image became incredibly important. I drew this picture because I've always liked representing ideas as images. But when we published the first version of this in 2012 as a discussion paper at Oxfam, just, putting an idea out, it had a huge reverberation. And a lot of people said, that is the picture that I feel we've been missing. That's the way I've always thought about what sustainable development would be. And now we've got the picture, and I could see it was just incredibly empowering to a lot of people. So it really set me on a path of thinking how we visualize and make visible the ideas and the patterns and the dynamics that we want to see in the world.
And it's fascinating because it all began with a pencil, because you start the book by saying the most powerful tool in economics is not money, not even algebra, it's a pencil, because with a pencil you could redraw the world. And you did redraw the world, and actually based on that initially very simple drawing, you created these 7 ways to think like a 21st century economist. can you tell us a little bit about the 7-point plan? Because it's extraordinary that actually the book is only the beginning, because in the meanwhile, the book is producing reality. Governments are adopting it. Holland is basically using it as a plan really for the future of Holland. Can you tell us about how from this very simple drawing you then defined these 7 points?
Sure. So the donut, you could say, is a goal, right? This is where we want to get to, but it's just an endpoint. And it's very, very important to have that vision of the endpoint, to know what you're aiming for, but it doesn't tell us anything, well, how do we get there? And of course, different people are going to have different proposals for how to get there. I wanted to put my proposal on the table and my understanding of what are the ways of thinking. So not like a set of policies, you've got to do this and this and this, but what are the ways of thinking? And again, that goes back to the economics education I received. And again, millions of students around the world are receiving now still. It's an old economics education with a mindset that I think is not fit for the 21st century. So I put aside all those old textbooks and I read everything I could of the economics that I'd never been taught. So ecological economics and feminist economics and complexity economics and institutional economics and behavioral economics. And there was so much wisdom and exciting ideas in these different schools of thought that I just wanted to bring them together and make them dance on the same page and say, what do we get? And that's how I came up with these 7 ways to think like a 21st century economist. So it's a mindset rather than a rule or a policy. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. Well, the first one is to change the goal of what we're aiming at. 20th century economics, my favorite piece of hosepipe. 20th century economics told us the goal was this, right? Never ending growth, the shape of exponential growth curve. And let's change the goal from that. Let's just say that is not what we're aiming for. We're aiming to get into the donut, which is a completely different shape of this feeling of dynamics. We've got to nurture human nature. So there's big debates about whether people are self-interested and competitive or collaborative and altruistic. I think the most recent science shows that we are both. And indeed in our own selves, and certainly in my now 11-year-old twins, I can see there's both going on all the time. And so we need to nurture that side of our nature that enables us best to collaborate, because we have to collaborate. There's going to be 10 billion people on this planet. And if we go around thinking that we're self-interested, competitive individuals, we don't stand a chance, right? So we need to nurture the side of human nature that enables us to collaborate. Another dynamic, actually 2 others I'll mention, are written here in the donut. We need economies that are regenerative and distributive by design. And I'll just say a little bit about each of those. So regenerative by design, we've inherited linear degenerative economies that are literally like a hose pipe. You take Earth's materials, stuff them in the hose of production, use them for a while, and then throw the result away out the end of the pipe, throw it away as if there was such a thing as away. There is no away. So we need to go from this linear industrial system to a circular industrial system so that there's no away. Everything goes back in the pipe and gets used again and again, far more collectively, more creatively, more carefully, and more slowly. So that's going from linear to circular, or degenerative to regenerative. And then the other one is going from the dynamics I think we have the economy today are quite divisive, right? The agglomeration of wealth in a very few hands tends to drive resources into the hands of a 1%, and it tends to centralize the returns of capital. And I believe we need to transform that dynamic in the way that land is owned, business is owned, in the way that ideas are owned, technologies are owned, so that we actually create this lovely ecosystem, a network of shared value in terms of the shared returns of enterprise. So the opportunity and value are shared far, far more creatively and collectively with everybody who co-create them. So we've got to go from being degenerative to regenerative, and from divisive to distributive. Now, how you do that, the policies that underlie that, that is all to debate for. And that, I think, is what makes it attractive to governments and cities, because they can have those debates. What would it mean to do this in our country?
And before we talk about that, before we talk about the way actually how cities and also entire countries now apply your book, I wanted to, before that, ask you about inspirations from the past, economists from the past who inspired you, because you create this safe space between the planetary on the one hand, and on the other hand, social boundaries. And I suppose, in art, very often the future is invented with fragments from the past. And I suppose with economics, it's the same. And you have mentioned Simon Kuznets, Amartya Sen. You've mentioned recently, for example, I've seen a wonderful conversation you did with Herman Daly. I was curious if you can tell us a little bit about, some economists who inspired the Doughnut.
So Herman Daly is the big one. And in fact, it was a real pleasure and privilege to have that conversation with him on Andy Revkin's podcast a couple of months ago at the beginning of the coronavirus lockdown, because I've never spoken with him before. But he drew this diagram, such a simple picture he drew. Let me see if I can create it here for us now. He drew a picture that basically said, if you've got an economy, here's my economy, a little stone, you have to recognize that the economy exists within the living world, right?
Yeah.
It's a subsystem of the living world. You can't just draw the economy in a textbook and let it just float freely on the page, because it's a subsystem of the living world. It's inside. And he wrote a lovely story, actually, about how he, in the World Bank in 1990, I think it was, they had drawn a diagram. It was a World Bank report on the economy and the environment. And they'd drawn a diagram saying, here's the economy. And Herman Daly was giving comments. He said, good, now please draw a box around that and label it the environment. And the second draft of the report came back, there was the economy, and there was a box drawn around it. And he said, good, now label the box, label it the environment. And the third draft of the report came back, and the whole diagram had gone, because that is a very radical move. To bound the economy inside the living world is probably the most radical move you can make. And indeed, it's the foundational step of ecological economics. So he drew a very powerful diagram of this. Now, when I first saw the Earth system scientist diagram that I was describing, with these big red lines shooting out, I was seeing Herman Daly's box or circle called the environment. And the Earth system scientists had put labels on it and put numbers on it and quantified it. That's what made me think this is the beginning of new economics, because we can now actually draw Herman Daly's diagram. The other big inspiration to me, sitting right behind me on the bookshelf, Donella Meadows. I would say she's the mother of systems thinking. So thinking about systems dynamics and making it popular and accessible. And this book, it's not always an easy read, but it's a classic read. And many people hold it very close and say, this is my intellectual Bible. This is the way I've learned to think. So it teaches you about feedback loops and feedback loops of reinforcing dynamics of things that spiral up or things that spiral down or things that balance off. And once you start to see the world through the lens of feedback loops, it changes everything. It changes the way you see social systems, political systems, ecological systems, and you start to feel the dynamics. So Herman Daly, Donella Meadows, I could name many, many, many more. I'll say one more, which is Amartya Sen, who is an economist, and indeed a Nobel Prize winning economist. So he's very respected in the mainstream economics field. But he, as a son of India, right, growing up in India when it was through a colonial era and in many communities deeply impoverished, he didn't start his economic thinking by saying, oh, let's start with the supply and demand of the market. He started his economic thinking by asking, what are the essentials of life to give people the capability to lead a life of dignity? So he started just with the essentials of life. And he came up with this fantastic theory of capabilities, that people need to have the capability to be healthy, to participate in society, to be educated, to be able to appear in society with a sense of dignity. And it's his expression of capabilities that I think underpins what we now see as the Sustainable Development Goals. So his starting point of what do people actually need, to me, is a really regrounding of economics. And that's why in the Doughnut, you don't see dollars. I mean, the only place where money shows up is that people need income to be able to buy other things in life. But most of this is the capability to lead a healthy life of participation and dignity, and the capability of the Earth system to sustain life as we know it. It starts with the fundamentals of human and planetary well-being, and then asks, okay, what kind of markets and governments and commons and institutions and incentives, what kind of economic designs would give us half a chance of getting in here?
And of course, now I also understand the chapter gets savvy with systems, because this whole idea of the Nutella meadows, it's all about the mechanical equilibrium and the dynamic complexity. Yes. Now, one thing I also wanted to ask you is, because your book is such an inspiration for our Back to Earth project, and we really put that in the center of the Serpentine as one of the central, aspects of the art institution in the 21st century. We have the general ecology project, so ecology is really at the center of what we do. But we also work a lot on the theme of inequality. We have the Radio Ballads, which is a flagship project in partnership with Barking Dagenham, actually where artists are embedded with social care and community research, and the Serpentine works in close collaboration with Barking. And in that project, we collaborate with the economist Joseph Stiglitz, who was actually introduced to us by Susan Lacey, of course, who, he talks about the progressive capitalism. And I was wondering how you connect to Stiglitz's work, if he's somebody you find inspiring.
Joe Stiglitz was very inspiring to me when I was a student, because he did some great work on information theory and blowing apart the assumptions of perfect market symmetry. So he's always been somebody who is unpicking mainstream economic thinking. But I certainly wouldn't put myself in a camp that says I'm talking about progressive capitalism. Actually, I find it really interesting that there's a move at the moment. There's a big wave of people talking about reimagining capital, resetting capitalism, conscious capitalism, caring capitalism, reinventing it. And what I just find really curious about there is that something there wants to be completely changed because it needs to be reinvented and reimagined and reset. But there's clearly something there that's not up for changing at all, because this word capitalism is just sitting there on the table. And I find that curious. Like, why would you just keep putting that word there? What do we even mean by capitalism? And what is it we're so attached to that we think we mean there, that we're not even willing to open up that box and examine it? So I don't engage with this framing of let's change capitalism. I say, let's just change the economy. And let's ask ourselves, what would be a distributive economy? What would be a regenerative economy? What kind of enterprises would actually be part of achieving that? What does their design need to be? And I think it needs to be very different from the design of enterprises today. Let's create in our minds the designs that we think are compatible with meeting the needs of all within the means of the living planet. And then we can come back and say, do you want to call that capitalism? It probably doesn't look like what we think of capitalism today. So yeah, I'm really fascinated by the overwhelming number of initiatives there are to kind of reinvent capitalism. Why don't we just reinvent the economy and take the weight of and the unquestioning nature of that word off the table? Open up that box. What do we mean by capitalism? And why are we so keen to defend it that we just put it on the table without asking ourselves?
And so you call yourself a renegade economist, thinking about reinventing the economy. And of course, the book which you wrote is for you a means of advocacy. You say that you're not alone. There is a flotilla of ships. There is a whole international student movement. You're embedded. You're part of this international student movement. Can you tell us a little bit about that, about how you see the book? Because I'm very interested in that, because John Latham and Barbara Stevini always said that it's about producing reality. They wanted to bring art into society and through that change society. And I always have the feeling with your book, it's the same. The book is not the end, it's just the beginning. And now you actually work with the book as a tool, you bring it into society. So I'm interested in that, the book as a means of advocacy, and also how you work with this incredible student movement all over the world.
So you're absolutely right. The book is just the beginning. When in the early 2012, we published the Doughnut as a discussion paper, just an idea at Oxfam, and it had huge traction. And I could see that there was something there to be unpacked, something there to be explored further. And I decided to leave my job at Oxfam and go and write a book about it as the next best piece of advocacy that I could do. So I see myself as an advocate for change in the sense of being actively aiming to change the world through my work, not merely to describe it. So I knew that writing a book that enabled me to dive in deeper and draw on all these different schools of thought, that was the most effective piece of advocacy I wanted to engage with. And it was at the same time that this student movement was rising up out of the financial crisis, when these poor students would go down to the pub after their courses with their friends in the middle of the financial crisis. And their friends said, well, you're studying economics. Come on, explain what's going on. These students said, I had no idea what was going on, because there were no banks and financial system in the models we studied. And they felt really embarrassed. and shocked that they, as students of that subject, couldn't explain it. And that's what gave rise to the international student movement, known as Rethinking Economics in many countries. It's Plural Economy in many other countries. Fantastic change makers from within the discipline. And at the same time, I wrote Doughnut Economics and said that I see it as part of the work that they're trying to do, transform the discipline. I then spent 2 years presenting the ideas of Doughnut Economics internationally, and again was really thrilled and struck by the traction that it's had. But after 2 years of presenting it in this conference and that conference and here and there, in the end I thought, okay, but enough talk, right? Who actually wants to do this? Who is already doing this? Because every time I would give a talk, some teacher would come up to me at the end and say, I'm actually teaching these ideas in my classroom. They're not on the syllabus, but I know that this is what the students need to be learning, and they are excited by it. Or somebody would come up and say, I've invented a game based on the Doughnut. Or we live in a community and actually we want to use it for thinking about the future of our community here. Or a civil servant would say, can we discuss this in government? Or somebody inside a social enterprise or a startup business would say, well, we really want to think about what it means for our company. So there were change makers everywhere already starting to use it and reflect on it. And so it led me to think, okay, let's create a community where these people can come together. And we actually launched this community online just a month ago. It's called Doughnut Economics Action Lab. The name is very intentional. It's Doughnut Economics Action, not talk, but action. And it's a lab because everything we do is an experiment. We are inventing the future of the economy that we have no idea what's going to work, how it fits together. So we see all of the attempts to make new economic practice as the best experiment we could launch. So we've got an online community where anybody can join as an individual. And we've uploaded tools of this is how you could teach Doughnut Economics in the classroom. You could run this as a business workshop for yourself, reflecting on the design of your own business. Here's how you could use it in your own city or your own nation. And then people can leave stories of how they've used the tools or indeed created tools of their own. So we've just started this. It's literally nearly a month old. And we've got over 2,500 members. We're thrilled. People have joined. Ministers have joined, community activists have joined, people from mainstream business have joined, people from very radical change making have joined. And so we are going to work with this community to evolve what it means to do Doughnut Economics in practice. Because I'll say last thing, I really do believe that 21st century economics is going to be practiced first and fully theorized later. It's not something that you just sort of write down in a textbook. It's going to evolve out of practice. And so it's these practitioners who are at the front edge of it, who are making visible the new kinds of patterns and the new kinds of dynamics that are possible. And later their work will turn into theory.
So it's very DIY in that sense, because you've just sent us a wonderful instruction. We're working on a book, actually, for the Serpentine project with Penguin, of instructions, of do-it-yourself instruction. And you've just sent us a wonderful instruction for that. There's a very much a DIY aspect in it, no?
Totally DIY. And in fact, going back to Delano Meadows, so if we think about change makers as a community of change makers, Meadows says, what is it that makes systems work well? And she says most systems that work well will have at least one of three principles. One, they're self-organizing, right? So you don't have top-down hierarchical control. So we've given up that control. We've put the Doughnut out in the commons. You can use it, you can adapt it and innovate with it if you stick to the core of its philosophy. And there's self-organizing groups popping up everywhere. We get messages from people in Cambridge, in Berlin, in Costa Rica, in Colombia, in the Caribbean, saying, well, yeah, we're starting to do a Doughnut here. So it's got that self-organizing spirit, very DIY. You have to do it yourself. We as a team at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, we're just 7 people. I mean, there's no way we could aim to do that change everywhere. We're intentionally a very small team. And we're saying, how can we be a small team that enables big impact? Let's design this precisely to be do it yourself. We write up, this is how we did it. Share back what you did. What did you learn? And then Donella Meadows also says successful groups have resilience. So you don't depend upon just one team for doing it. People are doing it in different places and they'll learn from each other and inspire each other. So yes, it's very, very DIY. I like that. DIY donuts.
And I'm very fascinated by the DIY donut, actually by the conclusion of your book. I was rereading the last chapter today, the summary, in a way, the finale. And, yeah. And there really you you say something quite similar to Joseph Beuys. When Joseph Beuys says that everyone is an artist, you basically end the book by saying that everyone is an economist, because our choices and actions are continually remaking the economy. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Is everyone an economist?
Yeah, I think everyone is an economist. Because so when when I was writing this book and I was picking my kids up at the school gate and I'd be chatting to other parents and they'd say, "What do you do?" I said, "Well, I'm writing a book about rewriting economics." When you say economics, the first thing that people do is pull back and they say, "Oh, I was never very good at maths at the school," or something like that. And economics is very remote for people, and it's a very elite expertise, and most people don't understand it. And it's about inflation and interest rates and bond prices and the futures markets, and everyone feels very alienated. Well, that's the way that it gets completely depoliticized and actually left in the hands of very, very few people to design an economy that's not in the interests of most people. So I really like Ha-Joon Chang, who's a fantastic economist as well, who said, economics is too important to leave it to the economists. We all have to get involved. And when I think about the economy as, again, in the language of systems thinking, the economy as an ever-evolving, changing, adaptive system, well, who are the agents of that system? Us, all of us, whether we are a customer or an entrepreneur or a community member or a parent or a commoner and a volunteer or a citizen and a voter or a protester in the name of the state. The students going on the Fridays for Future marches, they are reshaping the economy. And if we make ourselves aware of the role that we play, then we can say, actually, an economist isn't somebody who sits in an office writing equations. An economist is somebody who engages with the art of household management, which is what economics means, and knows that through their action, they can change the direction of how we are collectively managing our household. And we see ourselves very much as active shapers of the future of the economy. And I think it's a really empowering way to look at it.
Now, also, what is very moving for me with the end of your book is that there is a kind of a Rainer Maria Rilke dimension. When Rilke writes this beautiful little book, The Advice to a Young Poet, for me, the conclusion of your book is almost also like an advice to a young economist. I mean, you, of course, often quote Buckminster Fuller, who said, "You never change things by fighting against the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the old model obsolete." And that's, of course, what you said before about capitalism, this idea of inventing a new economy. At the same time, you also mention the students. You mention how the students have actually embraced the pluralistic education in many universities, Kingston, Greenwich in the UK, Siegen in Germany, Paris 7, Paris 13 in France, Aalborg in Denmark. But you also quote the students who basically say that the citadels, the London School of Economics and Harvard, have still not opened to these ideas. So the question is how, as you quote here, the students saying we have to storm the citadels. And you then end by really giving advice by saying, it's about being watchful over the ideas that others try to sketch up upon your mind. Can you maybe tell us, because I know that many young economists will listen to us also today. So in that sort of logic of Rainer Maria Rilke's advice to a young poet, could you maybe summarize what would be in 2020 your advice to a young economist?
Well, actually, that's really funny that you asked me that question, because I've actually been asked to write a short article, advice to an aspiring economist, a young European man who wants to study economics but knows that the mainstream education that's on offer isn't going to give him everything that he knows is out there. So it's part of a series of asking some economists to give advice to an aspiring economist. And I mentioned that he's a young European man because I think it's very relevant. My advice to a young economist is to always remember that who writes economics matters, and that the economic theories that we are taught were written by men, by white men, by wealthy white men largely in Europe and the US, in colonial countries that are dominant over the rest of the world and have the resources to extract from the rest of the world. And so when we have that perspective writing economics, it's inevitable that the perspective of those people will see some things and miss others. So when economic theory is predominantly written by men, they'll probably not remember to see the unpaid care economy because they're not daily involved in it. When it's written by wealthy people, they may not see the importance of putting inequalities at the heart of the analysis. When it's written by people from countries that have expanded overseas, they may not recognize the limits of the earth because they come from cultures that always found ways of acquiring more from elsewhere. So my first piece of advice to an aspiring economist is to recognize your own biases, to recognize your own circumstance, your own privileges, and to realize that if the theory is created by people who look like yourself and have your similar background, read widely. Read works from economics by women, from people of color, from people of nations that have been colonized, from people of different class backgrounds, because they will bring a completely different perspective. But I want to return to the students because I think what they're doing, as you mentioned, they're calling for pluralism in economics. And I think that's essential. They're very smart in that request. They're not saying, we think neoclassical economics is wrong, we want to be taught this one instead. They're saying, please have the respect of our intelligence and our ability to be critical thinkers. Teach us a diversity of views, just as we would be taught in history, just as we would be taught in other fields of study, in sociology, in political science. We'd be taught a range of perspectives and trusted that we would bring our critical faculties to deciding which theories we think are useful when. So teach us a range of perspective in economics and trust us to know when to bring those to bear. And that's why they call for pluralism. And it in a sense also invites these multiple perspectives from people so that you don't get caught just in the one perspective that only sees from its own viewpoint.
It's interesting because that also connects actually to something Brian Eno asked. The last conversation we had as a collaboration between the Doughnut and DLD was the conversation a few weeks ago with your colleague Mariana Mazzucato. And Brian had asked Mariana why she thought that the most relevant new economists, the most urgent new economists are all women. You, Mariana herself, Carlota Perez.
What did she say? Do you remember?
Yeah, we're gonna send you the recording of the interview. She talked about your work also.
Okay, so that's nice, and it's a really interesting question. I'll go on and mention other Stephanie Kelton. I will mention Donella Meadows. I think she's, one of the founding women economists that I don't think she'd have defined herself as an economist, but then what is an economist? I think is I want to take a broad church. I'll also mention Janine Benyus, who's one of the leading world biomimicry thinkers, and she's hugely influenced me. So just as John Maynard Keynes said, the best economists are part mathematician, part historian, and we need to draw from the best of other disciplines. I think many of the people who've most influenced my thinking certainly are women. And it's a really interesting question. Why are women's voices coming through now? Women tend to be, or at least when I think of the women whose voices are coming through now, are tending to highlight alternative views to the mainstream of neoclassical economics with the market placed at the center. So Mariana very clearly saying actually the state can be a really take an entrepreneurial role. Don't allow the state to be minimized in its role. It actually has far greater capacity. But other women are playing a role like Donella Meadows of see the whole system. Take a systemic, holistic view. Janine Benyus, see the living system of which we're a part. And on one hand, you could say, is it because women are always raised with the expectation that your life may partly be about a career that you follow, but it's always got the expectation that you may have a family, and the expectation is upon women to do the unpaid caring work. So even in the conception of your own life ahead, I think women are traditionally raised with a much wider, more holistic conception of the roles they may play. I'm speculating here. I don't know. And does that influence women's wider conception of economic value? Is it that much of women's unpaid caring work, which is traditionally the woman's role, it just doesn't show up in mainstream economics? So, sometimes people say, why aren't more women studying economics? And I think, well, why doesn't economics better reflect things that actually reflect the reality of women's lives? So I think that's partly what's going on. I think also there's a dethroning of the mainstream of economics, and new voices are coming through. So it's not just women. It's also people from other countries, other cultural backgrounds, like Ha-Joon Chang, who I mentioned, who was born in South Korea when people here called it a third world nation. And he's, through his lifetime, seen his country become one of the most successful, industrial and wealthiest countries in the world. And he will tell a very different story of trade policy and industrial policy and international relations from South Korea than a mainstream Westerner would tell you of what countries like that should do. So Amartya Sen, again, people from different perspectives that lie outside the very narrow perspective that dominated economic thinking to now. And I think it only can enrich the discipline. It can only enrich.
Yeah, that's what Mariana said. And I actually found her answer now, because Mariana talked also about Carlota Perez and the very patient work as a historian of Carlota Perez, of literally looking at hundreds of years at the different phases of economic development. And then Mariana mentioned your important work around circular economy and the way you work with city. And Mariana said Kate doesn't just go to Amsterdam and say, all right, this is what you're going to do, and I'm so smart. But actually you work patiently, that you go to Amsterdam, you work patiently, slowly listening to the civil servants in the city. Now, I'm very good friends with E.A.T, the poet, and she has always said she thinks that one of the most important things is in the 21st century is that we again learn to listen. So I wanted to ask you a little bit in that next chapter of the interview, how you really implement the book, and how when you go to Amsterdam, when you talk to the Dutch government, and obviously we all read the article that the Dutch government actually has now embraced your book and is really following, your book. How do you listen? And can you talk a little bit about this very patient work you do, and this very, also intense work with the civil servants in Holland, for example, just to find out how it works?
Yeah, so before I jump on to talking about Amsterdam, you're describing, Mariana saying that some women like Carlota Perez are involved in very patient work. I mean, you've just triggered in my mind the woman I need to mention, Elinor Ostrom, the first woman to win a Nobel Prize for economics. She did phenomenally patient work. So Garrett Hardin in the late 1960s declared the commons, when resources are shared in common, it will be tragic, they'll be overused, and there'll be a tragedy of the commons. And Elinor Ostrom, for decades, patiently went to places from fisheries to rice paddies to communities that were using resources in common, that were doing it and succeeding. And she studied and asked and listened and said, why does this work? And that led her to formulate, actually, we can have a triumph of the commons, and these are the bases and these are the criteria that make it succeed. So she's probably the archetypal woman of, like Carlota Perez, doing super patient work, starting with the empirical reality and theorizing. That's, for me, economics, let it be practiced first and theorized later. That's exactly what her work exemplifies. So let me come to the city of Amsterdam. The city of Amsterdam, it has high ambitions for transforming. They've said we're going to be a circular economy, 100% circular economy by 2050, and have a 40% drop in resource use by 2030. That's significant. We're going to have no fossil fuel vehicles in the city by 2030. That's less than 10 years away now. And they have all these ambitions for transformation. I think when they encountered the Doughnut, they realized it actually holds them together. It holds the social and the ecological. It holds together climate and material use. So they were very compelled to use it as a vision. And we worked together with city officials and change makers in the city to draw up a circular economy strategy through the lens of the Doughnut, and downscaled it to make it a tool for the city. So I'll just give the question that we invite every ambitious 21st city to ask itself. And I invite anyone who's listening to think of a city you know and love and listen through the lens of that city. So what would it mean for your city to be a home to thriving people in this thriving place, while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? And what that does is invite a city to think about its local aspiration, thriving people, whatever that means to the people of this place, in a local thriving ecological habitat, so that we are part of a thriving ecosystem wherever this city is located on planet Earth. And that's local aspiration, but it has to be set in the context of a global responsibility, because every city draws in materials and matter and has an impact on Earth's ecosystems, on those planetary boundaries, but also on workers in supply chains, on communities where resources are mined from. So we have to set it in that global responsibility. So it's a big frame. And the city of Amsterdam have really embraced it and not balked at its challenging results. It's like holding up a mirror to a city and saying, this is what you look like right now. It's not pretty. But by the way, just because you hide from it, it doesn't mean the portrait goes away. Face it and recognize that Amsterdam, like every high-income city, is living way over its fair share of impact on planetary boundaries, and massively reduce that impact, and that it's falling short on meeting people's essential needs within its own city, and it needs to do more to belong within its local habitat and reflect well for people worldwide. So lots of work ahead. What's impressed me about Amsterdam is that they've taken it within the city and are now turning it into a set of policy tools. So what kind of indicators will tell us that we're moving in this direction? How do we link this up with our strategy of having a far more circular food system? But there's also spontaneously in the city, a group of change makers came together from academia, from startups, from civic networks, from the communities in the neighborhoods, and they created the Amsterdam Doughnut Coalition. And they are change makers outside of government, but alongside government, saying we too are really committed to bring about this transformation in our city. And they're making it happen. So that's very DIY. They are in control there. That's a self-organizing group starting to make it happen. And the beautiful thing that we are now seeing is that they are inspiring other cities worldwide. So for me, peer-to-peer inspiration is a very, very important principle of this work. I mean, I can stand on a stage or come on a podcast and say, oh, you know, cities should do the donut. But what's really inspiring is when somebody says, look what they're doing in Amsterdam. They've adopted this as their model of recovery from the COVID virus. Why haven't we done that here? Can we do that here? What would that mean to do it here? And popping up all over the place, from Berlin to Cambridge to Brussels to Costa Rica to Cali in Colombia, people saying we're starting to do this now too. So that peer-to-peer inspiration is incredibly powerful.
Thank you so much. Now, we have an audience question, which is interesting, actually, which brings it to art, because the question is, I see art as an integral part of global communication, but how is it part of Doughnut's regenerative economics? And that's a really interesting question, I think, because I just read on your website that you're seeking graphic designers for the Doughnut economics. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that and what kind of, how art is part of the Doughnut regenerative economics.
So I first started, so I was always like, I love visualizing things. I love drawing and depicting visually the work I've been focusing on. So it came very naturally to me to look at the diagrams in my textbooks. And even the diagrams of 20th century economics, like the classic diagram, which would say, this is what a successful economy looks like. It's a curve of exponential growth. I mean, in a way, that's art. It's an icon. It's like a little caveman's drawing of endless growth. Or on the first day of every course, I'm going to bet, most students worldwide on their first economics class, they meet this diagram, this little crisscross of supply and demand. If you look at that on the page, it's like an iconic representation. So economists have always used images because they go through our eyes into the visual cortex at the back of our brains, and we don't analyze them in the same way that we analyze words. So they can sneak past our analytic faculties and embed themselves in the back of our heads and become the worldview by which we see the world. So I think economists have always produced art, whether you think it's good or bad art, but it's visually shaping how we see things. So the donut, whether you think it's artistic or not, it's visually shaping, visually interacting with our interpretation of image. And this is, just two-dimensional. It's like a diagram, but it's clearly turned out to be pretty powerful because of the number of people who've responded to it. And what made me very excited when I first published my book was the number of people who started doodling with it and creating artistic responses to it. There's on our platform, doughuneconomics.org, if you go there, there's a Maori interpretation of it from New Zealand. So some members of the Maori cultural community took the donut concept and actually flipped it inside out and redrew it from their perspective. So it's done in Maori art. People have started drawing the donut in a very simple way in chalk on the pavement and inviting pavement conversations. And so it takes it into street art. And for me, it being street art and accessible art that anybody feels they can access, they can be part of it. It's not distant art that they only admire, but art that they can engage in. That becomes a tool for action and a tool for people thinking, yeah, I'm an economist, I'm involved in this. Some community group in the Netherlands made some donut-shaped glasses that you had to cut out, these little green glasses, and you make them and put them on your face, and then you write on, or you stick on the picture, images of what the world would look like if you saw it through the lenses of the donut. And when I first saw that, it made me laugh a lot. And I thought, oh, those Dutch folks again, they're at it again, these crazy glasses that they were making. But that's people playing with it. And sometimes people say to me, why did you call this image the donut? I mean, it's about the future of humanity. There could be nothing more serious. Why did you give it such a ridiculous name? And yes, it is a ridiculous name, but the benefit of the ridiculous name is that nobody is scared of it, right? Many people pull back when you say economics, but nobody's scared of donut economics. It's a permission to be playful and permission to get creative and turn it into art. So I would absolutely love to see it revisualized as art, but also to work with artists and say, what would it feel like and smell like and look like to be part of a world which was meeting the needs of all within the means of the planet? Can we do immersive art that takes us into the donut? So I think there's huge potential for turning it into art.
And that's, of course, why we look so much forward to Rick Kiravanid's donut performance at the Serpentine. As of yesterday, we have his recipe for these vegan green donuts, which we're going to have. And I mean, Rick also talked about empathy. And I think one of the things which is relevant also in answer to this question, maybe in terms of art and the role of art, is of course the importance of empathy. And I wanted to ask you about Roman Krzanik's book and the dialogue between you and Roman, because you said actually in interviews that you very often kind of exchange discussions with Roman about empathy. And I was curious because, of course, the book, The Good Ancestor, is also a great inspiration, because it's a book which really is about how we can liberate ourselves from this short-termism in which the world is imprisoned. And Roman says through deep time humility, through legacy mindset, through intergenerational justice, through cathedral thinking, holistic forecasting, and last but not least, transcendental goal. And I found this interview where you said actually that back when Roman began writing about empathy, I didn't see the connection with my work in rethinking economics. But you say that actually over time, you started to see intersections. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so for full disclosure, Roman is my partner and husband. And when he wrote a book on empathy, it must have come out in about 2005, 2006. And what's been really interesting to see is that when he was writing this book on empathy, and he'd say to people, I'm writing a book about empathy, most people would say, about what? What's empathy? Literally, people did not know what it meant. And the last decade, I would say, has been the decade where empathy is the new emotional intelligence that people have learned. I remember the first time I heard it on Radio 4 in the morning. I remember the first time I heard my family members suddenly talking about empathy. You suddenly hear it in conversations, in conferences, and it was just popping up everywhere. And that's, to me, been an amazing transformation, and seeing and witnessing the arise of a new concept and emotional intelligence. And I suppose I've been seeing the same thing happening around the donut. At first, people say, what is this? Planetary boundaries? What is this? These limits? But now people understand it and get it and use it. And many people say to me, I was in a conference and people start talking about the donut. And everyone knows they're not talking about a snack. They're talking about this picture. It's taking on a life of its own. So it becomes almost a meme in social dialogue. And yeah, when Roman wrote about empathy and I was drawing a donut, it wasn't obvious that these were related, but more and more that I was in conversations people saying, can we really meet the needs of all people within the means of the planet? What's stopping us? The first answer is, well, it's about technology, it's about inequality, it's about governance. And then you go deeper and you say, well, it's also just about empathy. And whether we can nurture human nature and tell ourselves we're not this rational economic man that the textbook tells us are competitive, standing alone, and self-interested only. We are altruistic and empathic. We are the most social of all mammals. We are more social, especially with people who aren't immediate relatives. We outstrip the performance of every other mammal in our sociability. So let's recognize that in ourselves. But also, you just mentioned Roman's work, a book he's recently published called The Good Ancestor, which says, how can we be remembered well and take the long view of the future? And now our work really has come together, because if you want, you could say the donut is the big here. It's the planetary scale ambition for humanity, and the good ancestor is the long now. So we've started running workshops together where we invite people just to take this planetary perspective of what well-being means, and then to take it for 10,000 years forward. And it enables people to step out of the immediacy of the short-termism we get caught in, and the narrowness of the place where we live and the economy we're part of, and step out and take a much, much bigger vision. And it's no surprise people come with much longer term, more holistic, deeply rooted in living systems, views and positions they want to advocate for when they take that longer perspective.
Now, another question is, I recently listened to a fascinating talk with Michel Bouwens, the Luma Foundation, actually Jan Bolen and Maria Finder's interview with Michel Bouwens about the peer-to-peer networks, about the mobilization of makers, a lot of DIY question. He asks there how to deal with the big corporates is, of course, a key question. And you've spent time, of course, bringing your ideas to government, but also you've brought your ideas to companies. So I wanted to ask you about that. And we also have an audience question which ties in with that. The question is, should there be specific departments in companies that employ themselves with donut economy, or even a reshaping economy in general, and their role within that different economy? So it's a question about how to bring it into companies, how to deal with big corporates, how actually to have that great transition of big corporates through the donut economy, and then are there specific departments in this company?
So should there be specific departments in this company? Yes, there should. The department should be called the CEO. I mean that if we say, oh, let's have a company and there's a department called donut thinking, it'll never happen. The only place that it can be is in the CEO and at the level of the board. Otherwise, it becomes a nice to add on, something we'll do when the share price is looking a bit better. It has to be incorporated at the top. So how we think about companies, it takes me back to that question about capitalism. Let's go to the root of it. Let's not take anything as given. Let's really question. And this is a crucial issue for us, because we do have companies from 3 people social enterprise startups to Fortune 500 companies coming and say, oh, we're interested in using the donut. And the main thing we say is, if you want to think about how you could do business in the donut, we don't only want to talk about the design of your products, right? You know, like, I don't know, hand cream. We don't only want to talk about the design of the bottle that you made and where you sourced the ingredients and how much you paid the workers. All of these things matter in terms of being regenerative design and distributive design. But what we really want to talk about is the design of your company, because how your company is designed is going to determine whether or not you can become regenerative or you're stuck being degenerative. It's going to determine whether or not you can be have distributive dynamics of the value create, or whether you're stuck in an extractive mode. So let me show you the 5 principles of design that we bring to every conversation with companies. Here they are on a stick. Everything important is on a stick in my office. So the design and traits of a company. Number 1, what is your purpose? Why do you exist in the world? What are you in service of? And this is why the donut thinking has to be at the level of the CEO, because it has to be embedded in your purpose. I'd say a traditional 20th century company would have a purpose that was in service of itself. We want to be the biggest car manufacturer in Europe or something like that. Or even we want to deliver maximum returns to our shareholders. That's an incredibly narrow, outdated purpose. Does not serve the 21st century. Companies need a living purpose that's bigger than themselves. And the best companies I hear say, well, our purpose is to transform the energy system in this country and make it clean and renewable. Our purpose is to bring health to this community. That's a living purpose. Secondly, what are the networks this company moves in? So who are your suppliers and what values do they hold? And how do you instill your values in them? Who are your customers and what values do they hold? And how do you ensure that the networks you move in actually reinforce your values and purpose rather than pull you away from it? And then thirdly, how are you governed? Who is in the room and has voice when decisions are made, in the balance between the executives, the unions, the community? What are the principles and the culture and the rules and practices by which decisions are made? What are the metrics by which you judge success? Now, these three are the easy ones: your purpose, your networks, and your governance. Let's go deeper. I think of this as corporate psychotherapy. So as in psychotherapy, the most important things lie deepest. How is your company owned? Because whether your company is owned by a family or by private owners or a founding entrepreneur or venture capital or shareholders or by the state or by its employees, these are all very possible ownership designs, but they have a profound influence on the bottom design trait and the most powerful one, which is how your company is financed and what it does with the finance that it earns, what it does with its profits, and whether the relationship the company has to finance is essentially one saying, I'm investing in you because I'm expecting the highest, fastest returns that you can deliver me, and therefore profits are paid out to shareholders. Or whether finance says, I'm investing in you because, like you, I'm committed to transforming the future and I'm committed to bringing about that living purpose that you have. I also want a fair financial return. And what fair is a very big question. But I'm here for the long-term transformation. That's the kind of finance you want behind you. Now, let's go back to that question on capitalism. If we have a company or an enterprise that has a living purpose, that supplies customers who believe in that purpose and buys from suppliers who share that purpose and shares value with them throughout the supply chains, that governs itself in a way that is transparent and following the principles and ensuring that it's locked into this purpose, that is owned in such a way that it's not locked into driving financial returns into the hands of shareholders as high and fast as possible, but is owned in a way that generates value that's shared widely. Is that capitalism? I don't really mind. I'm not so attached to this word capitalism. Let's just leave it with the isms of the 20th century. Let's just start with the designs that we need of enterprises that can be regenerative and distributive by design, when finance is in service to the living purpose rather than the entire organization being in service to generating the maximum returns for shareholders. That, to me, is the deep redesign of corporates and business that we need.
Thank you so much. We have another audience question. Do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic has opened up a space for rethinking economics, but that opportunity needs to be grasped, otherwise conventional economics and lazy thinking will reassert themselves once more?
So the wonderful student movements Rethinking Economics just recently ran a survey of economic students everywhere, not students who are part of their movement, but students everywhere. And they found that over 75% of students said economics really needs to be rewritten in light of the crises that we're facing, because the theories that we're studying are based on general equilibrium theory, right? Students learn supply and demand and they learn equilibrium. And yet we live in a century, from financial meltdown to climate breakdown to COVID lockdown, of disequilibrium, of crisis, of churn. So the students themselves are saying that we need new economic thinking. I think we need more holistic thinking that recognizes an economy is the market and the state and the household and the commons. And when market spaces are shut down, such as by COVID, that so much of the work and the activity moves into the household and the commons and the state. And only when we recognize the value of that unpaid caring work in the commons and the household do we actually have a full picture of the economy. So yes, I think economics needs to be rewritten. And if we start with systems thinking, right, the Nella Meadows area, which begins with disequilibrium, which begins with things are constantly churning and moving and correlations are probably only passing. So don't tell us that they're laws, because they're just passing moments and then they come apart. If we start with systems thinking and complexity, we're going to have a so much richer model and understanding of the economy, which is going to keep throwing crises and unexpected events at us. So let's prepare ourselves for that from the start.
We have a very last audience question, which is about multidimensionality. The question is, as far as I can tell, these donuts and the information they contain are represented in a two-dimensional construct. If you could add a third dimension to the donut, z-axis, what would you try to capture, measure with it, and why? Now, obviously, during the talk, you have presented us with some three-dimensional models, but it would be interesting, to hear from you what would be the third dimension, and then we could even go further than that. I mean, superstring theory, I recently interviewed the scientist Witten, has up to 11 dimensions, so maybe it's interesting to hear about many more dimensions of the donut.
So I love this question because I've always wondered this is absolutely, whoever gave this question, absolutely right. It's two-dimensional. And actually, even a donut, the kind that we know that you can hold in your hand, it's not two-dimensional, it's three-dimensional. So let's imagine this like a flat board, and then we can imagine it has a third dimension in this direction. What would that third dimension be? It's really interesting. Some people say, well, that's obviously growth. That's green growth. No. And I would say, I don't think that's green growth. I think it's, look deeper, go for something more profound. I think it's human creativity, human capability. So if we can create a global economy that leaves nobody falling short on the essentials of life, and does so within the means of the living planet. So it's within these two. Some people say, oh, these boundaries are very limiting. I see a limit, and people don't like limits. It's not limiting. If we flip it, as this person suggests, into a third dimension, all sorts of possibility can rise here. And actually this donut becomes a torus. If I could show you, I don't know, let me swivel my laptop on the wall behind me. I don't know if you can see. Yeah, do you see up in the top corner of the wall, there's a diagram I've drawn on the wall of a torus.
Yeah.
Because it's exactly that shape that a lot of people say this is what living systems do, whether it's the human being or the core of an apple or a tree. It's that toric flow of energy in this direction, not the cut through of the donut. So actually, I think creating the third dimension of the donut is the big next step that will give it that multidimensionality. So thank you for that beautiful question. It's spot on.
And it brings us to my very last question, which is the only recurrent question in all my interviews, which is the question about the unrealized projects, because I find it very fascinating. You know, we spoke about Buckminster Fuller, and of course, we know about Buckminster Fuller's utopias and unrealized projects, inventors, architects, but we know finally very little about artists, poets, writers, and actually, as a matter of fact, economists, unrealized projects. And there are, of course, many different reasons why a project can be unrealized. It can be too big to be realized, too small to be realized. It can be a forgotten project in a locker. It's a project that maybe hasn't had time yet to realize. I mean, Ligeti, the composer, told me about all these decades of music he still wanted to write, but didn't have the time. But it can also be projects which maybe have been censored. Censorship can be a reason for unrealized projects. And then, as Doris Lessing always told me, it can also be that it's simply a project one hasn't dared to do yet. So within this whole range of the unrealized, I wanted to ask you to tell us maybe about one or two of your so far unrealized projects, dreams, utopias.
Okay, so I'm a sculptor, and I've always made sculptures and mobiles, and I love the fluidity of a mobile, the freedom of a mobile to rotate. And actually, just the last question, it's funny, but I would love to make that torus shape, and my unrealized project is to give the third dimension to the donut. What is it? What would that look like, and how would we embody it? Because it would no longer be drawn as a two-dimensional, it would be three-dimensional, and what materials would you make it from? But also, I wouldn't want it to be static three-dimensional. I'd want it to have that movement. And so how would we take the metaphor and describe what these dimensions stand for? So it's beautiful that the last question literally touched on this unrealized project, and it's other people clearly can see it, right? This is two-dimensional. It's asking to be three-dimensional. I think it's asking to be fluid, and it's asking to have complex dynamics so that it can keep moving, not in only a mechanical way, but in an unpredictable way. So for me, turning that into an artistic creation is an unrealized project. But I mean, I have to say that the project that I have wanted to realize is the one we've just started. It is Doughnut Economics Action Lab. It's our online community at doughnut.economics.org. We've just launched it a month ago. I've never been part of setting up an organization before. I spent most of my career as the researcher in the research team, quietly getting on with my research and never wanting to create, never daring to create something and to launch an organization which becomes a being and becomes a dynamic creature in itself. And we've just done that. And there's there's a huge vulnerability to pressing go and making it public and inviting people to join the community, because you're opening up and you're in a way you're definitely giving away control. You're allowing others to come in and start to shape something. But it's hugely empowering and exciting as well to see self-organizing groups start up and take up the principles you've created, and then you realize it's just a wonderful design project. How do we design this space? How do we design the rules? How do we design the principles so that people can pick it up, self-organize and create, and this thing has taken on a life of its own? And you feel a little artistic in the shaping of the rules and the shaping of the principles, so that when it goes out into the world, it still inhabits the essence of what you want it to create. So for us, there's a very important tension that we are playing with every day, which is between openness, allowing others to take and innovate, and integrity, making sure the ideas don't get misunderstood, or worse, get co-opted and greenwashed and watered down, particularly by a corporate interest that wants to make it sort of fit what they were doing anyway. So how do you balance openness and integrity? And it's, to me, the biggest design question I've ever been involved in. So it's not quite your unrealized project, because we've just started to try and realize it, and let's see where we get to.